Well, hello everybody. I have a lovely last Sunday presentation, paper, and interview for us, and this is for the September last Sunday, so please pardon it being a little bit late, but as they say, good things are worth waiting for. So I have with me today Rich Davis, who for over a quarter of a century has been doing archaeological research primarily in the Southwest, but more recently here in the Columbia Plateau. Rich is the Archaeological Advisor to the Methow Valley Interpretive Center, and he is the lead on the Methow Artifact Research Project, which we'll talk a little bit about later. He recently has written a paper, which we'll be sharing with you, and he's recorded a reading of that, which will be available on our YouTube channel. And that paper is titled, Our Valley, Its Past and Probable Earliest Occupation. For right now, Rich and I are going to have a little bit of a discussion to kind of dive deeper into that paper. And thank you so much for being here, Rich. We really appreciate it.
Well, this is really a pleasure for me, and I'm glad I have you interviewing me.
Okay, well, hopefully the technology will keep up with us. We'll see. Okay, so I guess first question would be, when was the first peopling of or occupation of North America? And you can speak specifically to the Pacific Northwest if that's helpful.
Well, that question is like so many things in archaeology. You're going to ask me later about probable. This is probable. However, weekly, monthly, yearly, these dates are changing and they're getting older. Right now, and this also applies to North Central Columbia Plateau, or at least the North Columbia Plateau. At Cooper's Ferry, they positively dated artifacts to 16,000 years before present. That is the oldest accepted date. There are some that are much older, but this is the oldest accepted date with the best reliable dating methods available. So 16,000 years before present.
That is
at Cooper's Ferry, which is at the mouth of the Salmon River as it flows towards the Columbia River, or as it flows into the Columbia River.
Great. And do you know, how does that fit within North America? And if you don't know.
Well, that in North America, there again, it applies. There are some older dates, but most of the reliable dates are around 14,000. So this pushes it back quite a bit.
Okay, great. So a big part of your paper, and a question I think a lot of people have, is how did climate change influence that earliest occupation of our area?
Well, because of the long glacial period, and we got into this quite a bit in the written part of the speech, the long glacial period that preceded what they call the Younger Dryas, which started about 14,000 some years ago, when the glacial period started warming towards its end. And that went on for thousands of years and created the prairies and plains across the North Central Columbia Plateau, where there was all kinds of grass, more water availability, and the large mammals and other mammals really were prolific. Then along came the Younger Dryas period, which was around 14,200 years ago, arguably, but that's the accepted date. It became much colder. And without going into the details of why that occurred, a lot of this vegetation and the animals that went along with it started suffering because the climate was not good enough to support this, and it was too cold. And so that changed the people's reaction that were surrounding this area. And so after that, pardon my phone, after that, we went into the early Holocene when things turned around again and became warmer. So the people reacted to this. Obviously, they were hunter-gatherers and they needed food, and they were willing to travel to get food. And so consequently, the climate, as it changed, both disallowed and allowed them to move in and out of areas in order to adapt to that climate and the resources that were available because of the climate.
Yeah, and so at that time, kind of here in the Methow, and this is not a question I gave you, Rich, so sorry, off the cuff.
All right.
What was the Methow like at that time, in terms of, I guess,
Well,
glaciers?
the
and maybe
Methow,
people?
again, according to various records that seem to be pretty reliable, the last part of the ice age, let's just roughly say, was about 14,000 years ago. That's when the glaciation ended and started melting. Again, we had what they call the Little Ice Age, or it was kind of like the Younger Dryas period, which coincided, as much as we know, with everywhere else. So we had a really unacceptable environment because it was either the rivers were flooding, the ice was melting, there was no particular vegetation here, and the animals, again, just weren't here yet. So there was no reason for people to be here. In fact, it was just plain unfriendly.
Okay.
However, that's what we're talking about here is the late Pleistocene, early Holocene boundary. About that time, things changed in a favorable direction. And at that point, let's just say between 10 and 11,000 years ago, the valley became, as far as we can tell, habitable. Things changed around to the point where people could come in here and find enough resources to survive.
Okay, so we have, yeah, earliest occupation, say in North America, 16,000 years ago, potentially older, but let's say that's the accepted conservative estimate. And here in the Methow, us being maybe a little higher, a little further north, we know that there were big glaciers covering much of the land that we call home now. And so with that rapid melting at the Pleistocene Holocene boundary, 11,000 to 10,000 years ago. And so I guess, do we have archaeological evidence to support that here in the Methow?
Well, we do, and that's probably the chief reason that I'm delving into this, is because a little longer answer might be that there has been no formal archaeological excavations done here that I can find. There have been some by the Forest Service and so on. They weren't trying to determine anything except whether or not something was in fact an archaeological site. So with that in mind, we really don't have any way to test or prove that any of the artifacts we found here have been were actually made at that time, right at the Pleistocene Holocene boundary. However, we do have projectile points that have turned up because of our Methow Artifact Research Project. And we have photographs of 4 projectile points and evidence of others that because projectile points are the only reliable way of dating, and this is a relative dating of any particular occupation at any particular time, then we can, and because these particular projectile points that we're talking about that were found here are able to be put in within that realm so that they have positive dates from other parts of Washington that are accepted by the experts, then that places our dates of these projectile points at 10,200, possibly over, but let's just say 10,200. I believe that it probably goes back further than that, but until we can get excavation proof or some kind of positive dating, we will never know.
Okay, so projectile points, maybe for people that don't know, can you say something about what they are?
Projectile points are, at least in the earliest times, could be several things, because people needed they are highly mobile hunter-gatherers. They needed a light toolkit. They needed to be able to travel and hunt as they went. They couldn't carry a lot with them. So they carried their projectile points, which happened to be used for possibly a knife, scrapers, and particularly to kill animals with when placed on the end, hafted on the end of a spear or a dart or more recently an arrow. So projectile points are what some people would just call arrowheads in a sense.
Right, or spear, I guess spear points would be old,
Yeah.
before there were
Yeah.
bow and arrow.
Arguably, again, because of the different areas of the country that we have proof of any use of an arrow, bow and arrow. In the Southwest, it was probably about 200 or 300 AD, and that's pretty well accepted. Here, there's arguments that it went back further. But until that point, the ladle, which was a handheld throwing stick, if you want to make it simple, a ladle was the accepted use of casting a projectile point or a projectile, spear, dart. So everything up until, let's just say, 200 or 300 years, what we call BC, I guess now, is probably an ladle point. And no one's probably ever going to be able to prove otherwise unless they find in some dry cave a bow and arrow that they can date positively to before that particular time.
Okay, great. And that gets a little bit at one of the questions I have is what adaptational responses to rapid climate change do we see at this Pleistocene-Holocene boundary in the Pacific Northwest? And I guess specifically in terms of, say, technology, so that's what we're talking about, projectile points, but also how people lived.
Well, I'm going to quote from Tiffany Fulkerson's paper, where she speaks about the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary. And she says the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary was significant enough to create pressures on late Paleo-Indian, early archaic peoples to change the way they utilized and conceptualized their environment. Adaptational responses were manifested in the form of migration, range expansions, shift in dietary habits, and the tools used to obtain subsistence resources and trade intensification. So that can apply directly to what we've been able to find out about the valley so far. Of course, in the earliest part, the early Holocene, 8, 9, 10,000 years ago, we have evidence, again, in the form of projectile points that people were here, but we don't really have any idea of what other tools that were used. In other excavations on the north central Columbia Plateau, particularly at Chief Joseph Dam, Rufus Wood Reservoir, before it was flooded, they have some evidence of, by excavation, of what people ate and the type of bones and so on and so forth that were associated with the animals that they ate. But as time goes further along, we get more and more evidence from other excavations, and we see that evidence here that they were processing plant resources and so on with monos, grinding tools. They were fishing and using net weights. They were adapting more to a more sedentary type of life because they could, because they had better tools, and because the climate, again, and the plant life and the animal life were abundant enough that they could be more sedentary and less of the hunter-gatherer. So that, of course, changed the way they lived. They could store tools that were too heavy to carry with them, and for the next time around, they could move their camps short distances to take advantage of changing plant life and the ability to acquire it. And they could move up into the mountains and go hunting and then come back and to a base camp and process the foods, basically because the winters were always bad here and they needed to acquire resources that they could store for the winter. And so as far as adaptation goes, those were some of the ways that they adapted. However, the proof of the age of so many of these stone tools, unless they're found in an excavation and able to be dated in context with the various levels of the excavation, we don't know if they were 200 years old or 1,000 years old. We can make a rough guess because we know, because of excavations in other areas, that those particular types of tools were not found in something that was dated to 5,000 years ago. But as we get closer and closer to the present, those tools start showing up more and more often in excavations, and we know that mostly those tools belong to a more recent occupation of the valley.
Okay. And maybe just to put it into some context and for our viewers, and I'm not an expert in this either, the ways that we could do dating would be kind of twofold. One would be if we did an actual excavation, archaeological project where we're digging down, and then we know that we see layers, you know, we find a stone tool at this layer and we can radiocarbon date that. And so that can be quite accurate. In the Methow Valley, we've never done that. And so here,
Essentially, no.
Yeah, essentially no. And so here we're fitting tools that may be found on someone's property because they disked a piece of land and it unearthed something, or they found it along an eroded riverbank or along a ditch that was, again, turned over. So we don't have that layering understanding or timeline, but we can fit that type of tool into other areas. Is that correct?
That's generally correct, and with the exception, again, of the projectile points, because as we get closer and closer to the present in time, projectile points changed more quickly. The arrowheads at that point changed more quickly, and so we're able to actually put them within a 200-300 year period in some cases. However, as we get further back in time, we're talking about long stretches, and maybe we can get close to within 2,000 or 3,000 years, but rarely any closer than that, again, unless we have some context that we can positively date.
Okay, yeah, thank you for setting that context and kind of how we know. You know, that's always one of my questions is how do we know that we know?
Yeah,
and
well, dating methods have improved amazingly, and it's really even hard to keep up if you're really interested in researching. But now they can use so many different kinds of dating methods depending on what they find. It's almost, well, definitely a science unto itself. So in Oregon, at Paisley Caves, they found coprolites, which are fossilized human feces, and they've been now able to date those by several different methods. And DNA is another big one. So there are all these possibilities, but we have to be able to get permission to excavate, have a real good excuse to get that permission, and it's probably next to impossible.
yeah, thank you. And that leads nicely into talking about the Methow Artifact Research Project itself. And so could you speak a little bit about that project and I guess our process for that project? How do we interact with the tribe, the official Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation? And I guess how do we do it all appropriately and respectfully?
Well, that's a good question, because there is a line that we have to walk in order to get people to come forward with their artifacts. People are a little bit concerned that they're going to get in trouble for having them or have them taken away or get their property invaded. And I think we've managed to prove that with the cooperation of the tribes, that we're able to function as the Methow Artifact Research Project and do our job because of the reasons that we're doing it. And I'll define those without any problems. Of course, if somebody's doing something illegal, there's a problem, whether it's with the tribes or with the state or with the federal government. So that just goes without saying. And those rules we won't go into here. But the project is an attempt to recapture the value that's held within privately held artifacts from the Methow Valley. And this is being done by essentially begging with the owners of such items to allow us, myself or Linda at this time, to photograph, measure, record any information we can derive from each artifact. This includes any information that can be verified regarding locations of the finds or any prehistoric sites. In other words, if we can't find a context or a pretty positive location where these artifacts were found, and they're just in somebody's garage, how do we even know that they really came from the Methow Valley? So we have to have some kind of a verification that we can pretty much rely on to even accept these artifacts as being from the Methow Valley. So we record and archive all the information. We give the owners of the artifacts that allow us to do that any security level that they desire, and we'll respect and guarantee that they can do anything they want with the artifact. They can allow us to further study us. They can ask us not to reveal the source of where we saw that artifact. And generally speaking, we've had that happen several times, several important times that would have been nice to go beyond where we could, but we just couldn't. But nevertheless, the information was reliable. The artifacts were reliable. We were allowed to photograph, measure, study, and invited to come back and do the same thing again, but they just wanted to keep their privacy. They didn't want their names attached to that particular artifact. It restricts us in a way, but still, how else would we get access to these artifacts? So the project's been very successful, and it continues on. Every once in a while, we need a little boost to get the idea out there that we're still looking for these things, but pretty consistently, we're getting calls and emails and recommendations from friends of friends that somebody would like to allow us to look at these things. And so one of the big benefits to this is not only allowing other people who are interested in the future to have access to all of our records, photographs, etc., that are archived at the Methow Valley Interpretive Center, but it also allows the Methow people who have been displaced from this valley the ability, if you want to put it that way, of taking pride in the renewal of their past, the length of time that they or their ancestors survived here in the valley and how they survived. And we keep the locations of any sensitive information private to the point of it just doesn't go out. And yet we're allowing them to take pride in the artifacts that we found, and we're exhibiting everything that we can at the Interpretive Center. The Interpretive Center belongs to the Methow people as much as anyone, maybe even more so. So they can take their friends there and say, this is what our ancestors did. This is the place to come and see what the Methow people, how they lived, what they left behind. This is what we lost when we left the Methow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And thank you for putting it in a contemporary context, that these artifacts that people find and that are really cool and fascinating are also the lineage and the ancestry of the present day Methow descendants. And that's important to remember, that, you know, these are the great, the ancient ones, you know. These were their possessions, and it says something about their way of life, both in terms of, I think it's interesting, both in terms of time, but also in terms of, because we are mapping it. So as you were saying, we need to really know that an artifact came from the Methow. And if we can, we want to know where. And we're not disclosing that information because that's really sensitive, but it does allow us to know the breadth in terms of the watershed and the geography of where people lived a long time ago. So Rich, I guess, yeah, and maybe just to summarize that so people are clear, if they find an artifact on their property, what are their options? What can they do? I mean, they can say nothing.
They can say nothing. They can be generous and want to contribute for whatever reason to our research. I think if they think about it, they'll realize that it's extremely important. They should take great pride that they were aware enough to not only recognize the artifact, but allow it to be studied to contribute to both our research and researchers that will be coming along for probably hundreds of years. this project that we're doing allows future researchers to pick up where we might have left off and add to it. But until we do what we do, they're not going to have what we were able to contribute.
Yeah, so they
so
can
another answer to
donate
your
it.
question would.
Yeah. I was going to just give a summary of, you know, they could donate it to the Interpretive Center. Some people have done that. And so then we become, you know, kind of in possession of it. We work with the tribes to see if it needs to go there or if we continue to steward it. It could be, they can invite you and Linda in to photograph it, to measure it, to do your research on it, so that then you can begin to figure out what is it, how old is it, what does it tell us that we didn't already know. They can allow you to see it, maybe even do some of the research but not photograph it. Or I guess they can just keep the lid on it and not say anything. So,
and the problem with that is that it's pretty harsh, but it's a selfish thing to do, because when the person who finds it, or their grandpa or whoever found it, becomes deceased or leaves the area, they're leaving with not having contributed the information that that particular artifact has, and they're also denying the value of that artifact. If they're just keeping it for their own in a drawer, I mean, most people don't display them out there where somebody's going to see it. It's not that big of a deal. It's just something cool. Put it in a drawer. It leaves the valley. Whoever gets it next sells it, which is a big deal. If it has value, they sell it. And it's just a complete waste of that particular artifact, that valuable artifact.
right.
Another thing that we do with the Methow Artifact Research Project is we confer directly with tribal experts all the time. And so they're aware of what we're doing. If they have any curiosity about any of it, we're willing to I've been over there and emailed back and forth with their archaeologists and the head of their Department of Cultural Resources, and we just have an understanding, I think, that's very acceptable to both sides. So if they wanted anything that we had in our curations, it would be theirs, I guess. We have no hold on it. However, they're entrusting us to show these things, to interpret it, and we have done that. We have a wonderful display center down there with interpretations of all these various artifacts, so that people can understand some of the history and some of the knowledge that surrounds each artifact. It's like, in my mind, like no other. So that's another big advantage of the research project, is it's contributing to our ability to educate the public.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that to the forefront, that when we can, when it's appropriate to do so, we are sharing this understanding with the public in a variety of ways, including the paper that you've written and that we'll share. And so it really is a very rich part of what the Methow Valley Interpretive Center does. And I think that it, to me, it really puts my love for this place into a broader context, geographically, in terms of time, so kind of time and space. It's very humbling as well to think that people have been living here and thriving here for a very long time, and the descendants of those people are still here, and their friends and their neighbors, and they're the ones that have been affected by the fires over on the reservation. So it's an important. I think it lends an important story to the story that we're trying to tell. So thank you for that work. Is there anything else that you want to add before we conclude? Is there anything that we missed?
Well, no, except I might say one thing about my feelings regarding this whole thing, and that is, I'm not necessarily a real spiritual person, but I think archaeology can lead you into a spiritual place where you begin to feel a connection and a strange love for the place where you live, and the more you know about it, the more you feel connected. And most people probably move to this valley for various reasons, but if they think about it, there's a connection, a spiritual connection to each place here. And if you allow yourself, you can feel it. And when you find one of these artifacts on your land, there is something about holding it in your hand that goes way beyond just holding an old thing in your hand. And I'll kind of leave it at that. But to me, that's one of the most valuable things that you can achieve by getting involved in this artifact research project.
Yeah, thank you for that moving conclusion and sharing something so personal. Well, I just want to thank you for all the work that you do for the Methow Valley Interpretive Center and for our valley through the Methow Artifact Research Project. I know you and Linda are putting a lot of time into this and a lot of your love into it as well, and we really appreciate it. And I guess if anyone is interested, if anyone finds something on their property, please get a hold of me. You can email Methow Valley Interpretive Center, that's mvinterpretivecenter@gmail.com. You can call me, probably easiest is just to call my cell phone, which is 509-919-0686. Go to our website, methowvalleyinterpretivecenter.com, and we can help you to connect even more deeply with what you've found on your property. And as always, remember that we benefit greatly from memberships, from donations. We are a lean and mean organization, and so please feel free to go to our website and hit the donate button so that we can continue to bring these great Last Sunday programs. We can continue to support the Methow Artifact Research Project. We can continue to support victims of the fires on the reservation as we've been doing the last month, and so much more. And thank you all for being a part of the Methow Valley and the stories that we're unwinding here. And thank you, Rich.
Thank you all.